He took off for what should have been a routine mission and was never seen again. March 28, 1944. The war was grinding toward its climax, Europe torn open by smoke and steel. In the fading shadow of the Third Reich, missions were becoming more frantic, more reckless, more final. Somewhere over the dense forests near the German-Czech border, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 vanished from radar, its pilot swallowed whole by history. That pilot was Oberleutnant Franz Amsel, 25 years old. Young by any standard, but a seasoned airman with over 100 sorties behind him. Born in Kassel, raised on discipline and duty, Franz wasn't known for bold speeches or reckless maneuvers. He was measured, efficient, loyal. His father had been a pilot in the Great War. His younger brother, still in school, looked up to him like a god. Franz had recently become engaged to a nurse named Clara Weiss. Letters between them hinted at dreams of Paris, of peace, of finally trading his cockpit for a kitchen table. But dreams die quietly in war. Franz flew with Jagdgeschwader 52, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected fighter wings. Their kill count was infamous. But by 1944, even their elite pilots were feeling the strain. Allied bombers came in endless waves, fuel was scarce, morale was slipping. Franz, like many others, had grown pale beneath his flight goggles. He still carried out every mission, but something in his letters had changed. Less about victory, more about surviving. The mission that morning was straightforward. Escort a small squadron of Stukas to a munitions depot near Brno. Intelligence suggested limited enemy resistance. Radio checks were routine. The mechanics gave the all-clear. Franz, meticulous as ever, triple-checked his oxygen mask, his fuel levels, his sidearm. He was quiet that morning. Clara had written him the night before. Her letter ended with one line. "Promise me you'll come back." He had folded it into the pocket above his heart. Then he climbed into his plane, saluted his ground crew, and roared down the makeshift airstrip, disappearing into a sky heavy with clouds. The Messerschmitt lifted gracefully, its silhouette sharp against the horizon. It was the last anyone ever saw of him. The plan was simple. Escort 2 Junkers dive bombers across enemy lines, protect them from interception, and return before dusk. No heroics, no diversions. A straight line in, a straight line out. Franz Amsel had flown dozens of missions just like it. But the war had grown cunning. What looked simple on paper could unravel in seconds. The briefing was short. Soviet patrols had been reported near the target area, but their fighters weren't expected to reach altitude in time. Weather conditions were poor, low visibility, scattered flurries, but nothing the Luftwaffe couldn't handle. Radio communication was predicted to be patchy. Most of the squadron brushed it off. Franz didn't. He always paid attention to the details others ignored. He stared at the map longer than the rest, tracing the flight path with a gloved finger, as if memorizing more than just coordinates. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 sat ready, glistening with frost. He ran his pre-flight checks with mechanical precision. There was no room for mistakes, not today. The canopy closed over him with a hiss. Ground crews cleared the runway. Then came the signal. Amsel's plane surged forward, slicing through the snow-speckled air. The bombers followed, their engines growling behind him like hunting dogs. For the first 20 minutes, everything went to plan. Radio chatter was light but clear. Clouds thickened overhead, casting eerie shadows across the forest below. Amsel adjusted his altitude, eyes scanning the sky, ears tuned to static. He gave a calm report, visibility decreasing, formation holding, then nothing, a hiss, a click, silence. The radio cut out at 1,423 hours. One of the bomber pilots claimed to have seen Amsel's plane veer slightly eastward, disappearing into cloud cover. No explosion, no smoke, just gone. The rest of the formation completed their mission. They assumed Amsel had suffered a malfunction and returned to base, but he hadn't. When they landed at dusk, his space on the tarmac was empty. Ground crew waited. The tower waited. Clara waited. By morning, hope began to drain. No distress signal, no wreckage, No reports of capture or surrender, just absence. The Luftwaffe filed it quietly. MIA, presumed dead. The war moved on. But somewhere, deep in the forested heart of Eastern Europe, Franz Amsel's final mission had left a scar no one could see until decades later, when the forest gave up its secret. The first sign that something was wrong came at 14:23 hours. Franz Amsel's calm voice had just reported formation holding as they crossed into enemy-controlled airspace, his Messerschmitt a black dart against a sheet of gray. Seconds later, the radio cracked with static, then went dead. At first, no one panicked. Communications in this sector were notoriously unreliable. Snow squalls and iron-rich mountains turned signals into whispers. Still, the silence stretched longer than it should have. At 14:31, one of the Stuka pilots called out that Amsel's plane had veered slightly east into the clouds. No break in formation, no distress call. Just a course correction, as though following some invisible path. When the clouds closed behind him, he was gone. The bombers completed their dive, dropped their loads, and banked for home, assuming Amsel would rejoin at rendezvous. He never did. Back at the airfield, ground crews lined the runway, scanning the horizon for his silhouette. The squadron leader barked into the wireless, ordering all frequencies to be opened. No response. Technicians double-checked the equipment. Static. They tried emergency codes, even sending a Morse signal. Nothing. By 15 hours, the flight controller marked his aircraft as unconfirmed. His last known position placed him over a stretch of dense, mountainous terrain straddling the Czech-German border, a maze of ridges and black pine that swallowed sound and light. Perfect country for a crash, perfect country for a disappearance. When night fell and the Messerschmitt had still not returned, the confusion hardened into dread. They searched the horizon until the stars rose. Clara, back in Kassel, had no idea. She was probably folding his latest letter into a drawer, unaware that the man who wrote it was now a ghost drifting somewhere above a frozen forest. No explosion, no smoke, no trace, just silence. At dawn the next morning, the Luftwaffe launched a recovery flight. 2 reconnaissance planes traced Amsel's planned route, their crews scanning the snowfields below for wreckage or fire. Nothing. They widened their search grid, flying low over valleys and ridges, so close the frost-coated treetops brushed the fuselage. Still nothing. The Messerschmitt had simply disappeared. Weather made the search brutal. Visibility dropped to mere meters in places. The forests were a labyrinth of ice-laden branches and deep ravines. Snow muffled everything, sound, color, movement, erasing even the faintest clue of a crash. To make matters worse, the area was crawling with enemy patrols. One reconnaissance plane returned with bullet holes in its wing, the crew shaken but alive. Searching for one lost pilot in hostile terrain meant risking many more. For 2 weeks they tried. Flight after flight, grid after grid. Even ground patrols were sent into the foothills under cover of darkness, combing for metal fragments or parachute silk. They found nothing but deer tracks and shell casings. No oil slick, no twisted wing, no sign of Franz Amsel. By the 3rd week, command's enthusiasm waned. Fuel shortages were critical. Every hour spent searching was an hour stolen from combat operations. On April 19, 1944, the order came down: terminate the search. The file was stamped "Missing in Action" and closed. At the airfield, Amsel's bunk remained exactly as he'd left it, boots lined up, journal on the nightstand, Clara's letter folded in his breast pocket of his spare jacket. His comrades flew their missions, but the empty space on the tarmac where his Messerschmitt should have been became a quiet wound no one spoke of. In the official record he was gone, erased by war and weather. But deep in the forest, the truth waited patiently under moss and pine, undisturbed for decades. In Kassel the knock never came. No telegram, no uniformed officer at the door, just silence. For weeks, Clara Weiss visited the post office every morning, hoping for a letter from Franz. She clutched the last one he had sent like a charm against fate. It was dated March 25, 3 days before his disappearance. Dearest Clara, it read. The sky is gray today, but I am thinking of you and the way your hair looked in the light outside the cafe. I have decided I will keep that memory with me on every flight it steadies my hands. You asked if I am afraid. I am not. But I do long for the war to end. I would like to grow tomatoes and sit on a porch with you. Can we have that? Promise me you'll wait. She did wait, at first with hope, then with denial, and then with a kind of quiet resignation that calcified into grief. Clara never married. She kept Franz's letters in a wooden box lined with linen, and each spring she planted tomatoes in her window garden just in case. Franz's parents were told little. Missing during a routine escort mission was the official line. His father, a veteran of the Great War, said nothing for weeks. Then one morning, he took Franz's medals off the wall, placed them in a drawer, and never mentioned his son again. His younger brother Jakob, only 17, wrote a letter to the Luftwaffe asking if he could take Franz's place in the squadron. It was never answered. Over the years, rumors spread. Some claimed Franz had defected, flown west, and disappeared into Allied airspace. Others whispered he had been shot down and captured, perhaps tortured, perhaps worse. A few suggested he'd staged the whole thing, unwilling to die for a cause he no longer believed in. But Clara knew better. She had read his letters. She knew the truth was simpler and far sadder. Franz had taken off for a routine mission, and something final had happened up there, above the trees. He hadn't run, he hadn't betrayed anyone, he just never came home. It was late autumn in the Bohemian woods, thick with fog, heavy with silence. A pair of forestry workers were marking new boundary lines deep within the Sesquilez, near the old Czech-German border. The terrain was brutal. Jagged hills, forgotten trails, trees twisted by time and snow. Locals called it the Sleeping Forest, a place where compasses spun and echoes got lost. Most avoided it, but not everyone. They were halfway up a ridge when one of the workers noticed something jutting out from the undergrowth, a glint of dull metal half buried beneath layers of leaves and lichen. At first, he thought it was old mining debris, maybe a fuel drum, maybe scrap from a tractor long since swallowed by the forest. But as he brushed away decades of soil, his fingers found something unmistakable. Riveted steel, curved, aerodynamic, a shape that didn't belong to anything built for the ground. They kept digging, pulling aside moss-covered branches and twisted vines until the silhouette revealed itself, a crumpled wing, faded gray paint, the broken glass of a cockpit canopy, shattered long ago. And then, barely visible under a streak of rust and time, the insignia, black and white, sharp even now, the Iron Cross of the Luftwaffe. It wasn't a myth, it wasn't a ghost story. It was real. Word spread quickly. Park officials sealed the area within hours. Historians and archaeologists were flown in from Prague and Berlin. Journalists sniffed around, kept at bay by caution tape and silent guards. What lay twisted in the roots wasn't just a machine, it was a time capsule. A war relic untouched since the final days of World War II. Inside the cockpit they found what was left of a man. Skeletal remains, still seated, uniform fragments, a leather glove, and tucked into a rusted side compartment, a water-damaged photo of a young woman with soft eyes and pinned-back curls. Written faintly on the back, in German. For Clara, immer. For Clara, always. The discovery stunned everyone. 70 years had passed. Trees had grown through the fuselage, moss had climbed over the wings, but the forest had kept its secret, quiet, hidden, waiting for someone to listen. Franz Amsel hadn't vanished. He had fallen alone, forgotten, entombed in branches and snow. Until now. By the time the officials arrived, the sun had dipped below the tree line, casting the ridge in an eerie golden hush. The wreck was cordoned off with caution tape, though nature had done its own work of keeping it hidden for more than 7 decades. Park rangers stood guard in silence. No one spoke much. There was something sacred about the scene, like stepping into a time capsule with its lid barely cracked open. A team from the Czech army arrived first, followed by military historians and forensic archaeologists from both Prague and Berlin, An aviation specialist identified the aircraft immediately, a Messerschmitt Bf 109, one of the Luftwaffe's most iconic fighters. The fuselage was dented, one wing sheared off by a tree that had grown through it, but the frame was mostly intact. It had slammed into the hillside nose first, likely pancaking on impact, and then slowly been buried by time. They found the serial numbers etched into the side panel, partially corroded but legible. Cross-checked with Luftwaffe records, it confirmed what some already suspected. This was Black 4, the Bf 109 flown by Oberleutnant Franz Amsel, declared missing in action on March 28, 1944. It shouldn't have been here. The coordinates placed it nearly 180 miles southeast of his assigned flight path. He had gone completely off course into terrain no one had ever searched. There was no sign of an ejection, no parachute, no drag marks in the soil. Amsel hadn't tried to land. He had stayed with the aircraft until it met the trees. Questions began to swirl. What had pulled him so far from his route? Mechanical failure? Enemy pursuit? A navigational error in low visibility? Or something else entirely, something no one had considered? The forest, cold and quiet, offered no answers. Only the wreckage, only silence. What they would find next inside the cockpit would deepen the mystery and finally confirm what Clara had always believed in her heart. He hadn't deserted. He hadn't disappeared. He had never left that forest at all. They opened the cockpit slowly, careful not to disturb what had rested undisturbed for generations. The canopy was fractured but sealed shut by rust and pressure. When it finally gave way with a groan, a wave of stale, earth-scented air spilled out like opening a forgotten crypt. Inside, slumped forward in the pilot's seat, were the remains of Oberleutnant Franz Amsel. The skeleton was still strapped in, flight harness wrapped around a uniform long since decayed. His boots were intact, the leather cracked but unbroken. One gloved hand rested on what was left of the yoke. The other was curled around something pressed to his chest. They found dog tags, barely tarnished, confirming the name stamped on the Luftwaffe records. But it was the other objects that truly stopped the team cold. A black and white photograph creased at the edges, still legible after all these years. The same one found earlier, Clara, smiling in soft light, her name scrawled on the back in faded blue ink. Beneath his seat was a weather-stained flight map, with hand-drawn marks and penciled corrections, evidence he had tried, in those final minutes, to reroute. There was no journal, but tucked into a small side pouch was something else, a folded scrap of stationery written in a shaky hand. The words, barely decipherable, read, "Engines failing, heavy ice, no bearings. Tell her I tried." The forensic team collected samples for DNA testing, though there was little doubt. Weeks later, results came back, 99.9% match to a living relative, Jakob Amsel, now 98 years old, living in a retirement home near Bremen. When told the news, Jakob reportedly sat in silence for a long time, then quietly said, "So he didn't run. I knew he wouldn't." The discovery raised as many questions as it answered. What had caused the failure? Why had he deviated so drastically from his route? Was it a miscalculation or a desperate attempt to land somewhere, anywhere, before the cold and the clouds swallowed him whole? Whatever the answer, one thing was certain: Franz hadn't disappeared into legend. He had simply fallen somewhere no one thought to look, and for 70 years the forest had kept him. Until now, the discovery of Franz Amsel's wrecked Messerschmitt sent ripples through military history circles. News outlets called it a lost ghost of the Eastern Front. Aviation forums lit up. But beneath the fascination was a deeper question that refused to settle. Why was he there? Historians quickly weighed in. Some pointed to the flight logs. Bad weather had been reported along the original flight path. Low visibility and failing radio contact could easily have thrown Amsel off course. A simple navigational error, amplified by storm cover and broken instruments. Others weren't so sure. The aircraft's location nearly 200 miles southeast of his mission corridor wasn't just a detour. It was a complete disappearance. He hadn't just gotten lost. He had vanished. Then came the forensic results. Analysis of the wreck showed evidence of mechanical failure. Specifically, one engine cylinder had cracked, likely due to ice forming at high altitude. Oil pressure dropped. The propeller marks on nearby trees suggested the engine had still been turning when he hit the hillside, but barely. Experts agreed. The aircraft was dying in the air. But one fact puzzled everyone: he hadn't ejected. The cockpit canopy, though broken from the crash, showed no signs of forced release. The seat wasn't disturbed. There was no parachute, no drag marks outside. Amsel had stayed in the plane. Some believed he never had the chance. Ice, disorientation, and altitude may have made ejection impossible. Others weren't so sure. Was it loyalty, fatalism, or something else? A fringe theory emerged that Amsel had intended to disappear, that he had seen the war turning, felt the collapse of the Reich, and decided to flee, maybe even defect. Maybe he flew into the mountains hoping to cross into neutral territory. Maybe he aimed for a soft crash, only it didn't go as planned. But those who had read his letters, who knew his temperament, rejected the idea. Franz wasn't reckless. He wasn't political. He wasn't a deserter. He was a man trying to survive a dying machine in the heart of a frozen forest. And then, investigators found something else wedged beneath the seat in a compartment overlooked on first inspection. A notebook. Weather-stained, scorched at the edges, but inside, the words were still legible, and they told a very different story. The notebook was small, leather-bound, its cover buckled from moisture and heat. A flight log mostly. Standard Luftwaffe issue. Each page dated, with neat, mechanical handwriting. Coordinates, weather, altitude, fuel consumption. It was the kind of record a pilot kept out of duty, not sentiment, until the last few pages. March 27, 1944. Fuel delay this morning. Cloud front thicker than expected. Adjusted heading south to avoid turbulence. Ovreux, March 28, 11:40. Visibility dropping. Instruments unreliable. South ridge not where it should be. Using compass only. 12:35. Radio gone. Engine stuttering. One cylinder. Adjusting altitude to conserve fuel. 13:02. Saw enemy scout plane at distance. No engagement. Possibly Soviet. No way to confirm. Then, near the end, the entries shift. The writing grows uneven, slanted, ink smudged by shaking hands or turbulence. 13:58. Altitude unstable. Engine losing compression. Can't climb. Will try to stay low. 14:17. No contact, no bearings, alone. And then, the final entry, just a single line scrawled across the page, tilted toward the margin. Tell her I flew as far as I could. There was no signature, no coordinates, just those 8 words. Not military, not technical, personal. The tone suggested he had accepted what was coming. He wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't running. He was trying to land, trying to find a place where metal and earth might meet gently. Where the crash wouldn't consume him. Where he might survive long enough to crawl from the wreck, write a name in the snow, and wait for rescue. But the forest had other plans. The journal put to rest the rumors. No defection, no treason. Just a man against gravity, ice, and silence. A man who chose to stay with his machine, even as it failed him. A man who, in his last conscious moments, thought not of war or country, but of her. And somewhere in a drawer in Kassel, that photo still sat, faded and folded, waiting for a homecoming that finally came. Just 70 years too late. The crash site was buried in one of the most remote stretches of forest in the Bohemian Highlands, an area known for its steep ridges, thick canopy, and unpredictable weather. Even modern GPS devices struggled to hold a signal. During World War II, it had been a blank spot on the map, barely sketched out, unpatrolled, and largely forgotten. What little was charted had been inaccurate hills mislabeled, valleys erased, whole ridges misplaced by cartographers working from outdated aerial photos. Franz Amsel hadn't just gone off course, he had flown into the unknown. Geologists studying the site confirmed that the Messerschmitt had come down at an angle that forced it between two ridgelines, settling in a dense pocket of spruce and larch trees. The surrounding terrain rose sharply on all sides, creating a natural basin. When the plane crashed, the trees had swallowed it whole. Over the years, the forest grew up around it, branches knitting over twisted steel, bark pressing against shattered glass. From above, the canopy appeared unbroken. From the ground, it looked like just another hill. And yet, not everyone had been unaware. Villagers from a nearby settlement just 15 kilometers away told stories, passed down from grandparents, whispers of a strange engine sound one snowy afternoon in 1944. A sputter, a whine, then silence. Some said it was a Soviet aircraft being chased. Others claimed it was a plane without a flag. One man remembered his grandfather swearing he heard something go down in the hills but was too afraid to investigate, fearing landmines or Allied spies. But no one found anything. Not then, not for decades. It wasn't until satellite imagery and logging projects brought humans back into this forgotten corner that the truth came to light. Not sabotage, not defection. Just one man's desperate fight against ice, distance, and fading altitude, and a forest more patient than any grave. The terrain hadn't just hidden him, it had kept him, wrapped in moss and memory, until the world was finally ready to remember. Franz Amsel came home 77 years after he vanished. His remains were flown to Germany in a sealed military transport, escorted by an honor guard. A simple wooden casket draped in the flag of a country that no longer existed, yet still claimed him as one of its own. The Ministry of Defense coordinated the ceremony. Historians ensured every detail was correct. But it was the people, the ones who remembered, who gave it meaning. A small crowd gathered at the cemetery in Kassel. Not many were left who knew his name, but those who came stood in silent reverence. Among them was Jakob Amsel, now frail, eyes wet behind thick glasses, holding a photograph of two boys in uniform. "My brother," he whispered to a reporter. He kept his promise. He came back. Beside him stood Clara Weiss, her hair silver now, hands trembling, a cane supporting her steps. She hadn't spoken publicly in decades. But when asked, she simply said, "I always knew he didn't leave me." Not truly. Her eyes stayed fixed on the casket the entire time. Military honors were rendered. A bugle echoed across the field. 3 volleys fired into the sky. A folded flag was handed to Clara, though the officer giving it seemed unsure whether to address her as widow or fiancée. It didn't matter. She took it without a word. Inside Franz's recovered flight jacket, preserved and catalogued by forensics, was her photograph. Still intact, still folded. The ink had faded, but the name on the back for Clara, Immer, remained. It was placed beside the casket as the final tribute. For a war that consumed millions, stories like Franz Amsel's rarely made it past a footnote. One pilot among thousands, one wreck among ruins. But this wasn't just about a crash, it was about the weight, the decades of unanswered questions, the silence that clung to families like dust, and the quiet miracle of a truth finally returned. The grave marker was simple: name, rank, dates, and beneath them, a final line carved in stone. He flew as far as he could. The update came quietly, almost bureaucratically. A digital entry in a military archive was amended. Franz Amsel, status: Mia changed to Kaya, confirmed March 28, 1944. A single keystroke, 7 decades in the making. The paper record, once yellowed and stamped with red uncertainty, was now enclosed in a file marked resolved. A missing pilot found. A mystery closed. The Luftwaffe's historical division issued an official recognition. Amsel was posthumously awarded the Iron Cross First Class, a formality more symbolic than meaningful. But to the few who remembered him, not least of all Clara and Jakob, it was something. Proof that he hadn't run, that his name, spoken softly all those years, had finally echoed back with an answer. A photo of the crash site, taken from a drone, was added to the war records. A small black cross marked the location. The coordinates sat next to a short report. Pilot likely succumbed to mechanical failure and inclement weather. No sign of enemy engagement. Oh, but the more important line came at the end. Case closed. And yet, it didn't feel closed. For every story like Franz's, there were hundreds, thousands left behind in silence. Aircraft that vanished over the Alps. Bombers that limped past Normandy and were never seen again. Soldiers who simply stepped into fog and were absorbed by it. War forgets. History forgets faster. But now, for one family, one fiancé who never stopped hoping, one brother who never stopped believing, a page had turned, and in its place was not just a record corrected, but a legacy restored. In the weeks after the wreckage was discovered, others began to speak. Local elders came forward with stories that hadn't been told in years. Hikers who recalled stumbling on strange debris in the woods, twisted metal half buried beneath roots, strange patches of scorched earth, rusted fragments they'd assumed were from old logging machinery. One man, a former ranger, confessed he'd once seen a cockpit canopy wedged between two trees during a winter patrol in the 1980 seconds. But when he returned in spring, it was gone, buried by fresh snow, or swallowed again by the earth. He'd convinced himself it had been a trick of the light. There were whispers of other crashes, planes that went down and were never officially found, wartime aircraft, civilian disappearances, even Cold War surveillance missions lost to time, all hidden in the same remote terrain, a forest that never gave up its dead easily. Geographers began calling it the Vanishing Belt, a stretch of mountainous woodland so dense, so geographically complex, it rendered aerial searches useless and ground expeditions near impossible. It was more than terrain, it was a threshold, a place where signal, sound, and memory seemed to falter. And so, the forest became a character in its own right. It had no malice, no agenda. But it had patience. It did what nature always does. It covered what didn't belong. It softened metal with moss. It turned fire into silence. It watched quietly as families mourned sons who had simply flown too far. It wasn't until someone stepped off the trail, years later, by accident or fate, that the forest allowed the truth to surface slowly, piece by piece, like memories returning after a long sleep. Franz Amsel had not been taken by war alone. He had been held by the forest, and when the time was right, the forest let him go. But the others? The other crosses? The other ghosts? They are still waiting. War takes many things. Lives, lands, futures that never get to happen. But perhaps the cruelest thing it takes is memory. For every name carved into stone, there are hundreds more that fade buried not by dirt, but by time. Franz Amsel could have been one of them. He didn't run. He didn't defect. He didn't betray his country, or his comrades, or the woman who waited for him across seas of fire. He followed his orders. He flew into a storm, engines sputtering, radio dead, eyes searching the horizon for something he never found. Not a target, not an enemy, but a way home. His final moments weren't witnessed. There was no grand dogfight, no glorious explosion. Just a failing machine over a frozen ridge, a decision made in seconds, and a canopy that stayed closed. He stayed with the plane, he stayed with the promise. In a war that devoured continents, his was a quiet death. Unseen, unrecorded, unmourned until now. But the silence wasn't empty. The forest remembered. It remembered the moment metal kissed the trees. It remembered the hiss of snow on cooling steel. It remembered the photograph folded into his jacket pocket, the one with the smile he never stopped flying toward. And when it was ready, when the wind shifted and the right people came looking, it finally let him be found. Now, his name is spoken again. His photograph sits beside plaques and medals. His grave is visited. His story is told. Not as a footnote, but as a reminder. Every missing man was a son, a brother, a lover, a name someone whispered in prayer long after the world stopped listening. Franz Amsel didn't make it home, but in another way, maybe he did. His memory flew farther than his plane ever could, and the forest? It never forgot. The forest kept his secret for 70 years. But now, his story can finally be told. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.